Thank you for having me here today. I'm going to talk about what I see as the link between Stoicism and sustainability. Now, some people here, I often get asked actually, well, how do they link? Because Stoicism is about individual self-improvement and sustainability is about outside of us. So what's the relationship there? Are they related? Are you forcing something there? I'm not claiming to be an expert on either Stoicism or sustainability, though I've studied both for over 10 years. But this is my own personal reflections on how I think that they can link together, and I think that, that Stoicism can benefit from sustainability, and sustainability can benefit from Stoicism. So, to give you a little bit of an anecdote, late last year I went on holiday with my partner to Bruges, and we stayed in this really beautiful B&B with a really a great host there who really looked after us. And on the wall in the bedroom in the B&B, they had this painting, and I read it, and given my line of work and my interest, it really stuck with me. And it basically says, if you can't see, it says, the world doesn't want to be saved, she wants to be loved, that's how we save her. And it just says, oh, that's a really neat, it just resonated with me. And I commented on it, and when I left, she kindly, she had it packaged up and she gave it to me. And I took it home to me, and now it's on my wall. Now, I understand that in sort of modern world, the word love is seen as a kind of a cuddly thing, and again, it's sort of like that's a very a woolly and kind of emotional way. And again, how does that fit with sustainability, and how does that fit with Stoicism? Stoicism is the rational way of engaging with the world. Why do we need emotions such as love? And I hope in this presentation I will give you a kind of a link here. So, to go back, so I think in my introduction I said that I work at IPPR. IPPR is, I think some of you may have heard of IPPR. It's a progressive think tank. We've got offices based in London, Manchester and Scotland. And essentially what we're doing is we're making, with this project I'm working on, is making this a progressive case for us to move the economy into more fastly towards net zero. We want to make that transition fairer so that it doesn't lead to regressive policies and harm the more vulnerable members of society. And prior to IPPR, I worked at PricewaterhouseCoopers in green investment and green pensions and ESG. So again, the types of stuff that Guy was talking about previously. So in this talk, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of a very whistle-stop tour of what I see as the state we're in and why I think it's become more pertinent. And then talk about my response, or what I think could be a Stoic response to it. So, who's seen an image like this before? Yeah. So, basically, we've known about climate change for quite a long time, since around the early 1900s, if not sooner. And these are carbon emissions, specifically, rather than greenhouse gases. And basically, if you look at it, it almost follows an exponentially rising curve. And if you were an alien looking at, and you were basically looking down at humans and thinking, okay, so what's this issue they've got down there? You'd probably say, well, actually, these humans haven't actually discovered that climate change is a problem yet, because they've shown no indications thus far of actually doing anything about it. And so we have this issue, and we've been active on it since I got into policy circles in about the 1960s, when a briefing note went to the White House saying, we think that anthropogenic climate change is going to be an issue, and that we're causing it, and we think that it might be destabilizing the climate. And then by the kind of late 70s, 80s, we were having international conferences on it. And we've had a succession of those over the years, culminating most recently in, well, not most recently, sorry, a major one recently was Paris, and we've also got one in November in the UK in Glasgow. Now, at Paris, prior to Paris, the target that the UK or the world was aiming for was to try and restrain global temperature rises to less than 2 degrees. One of the outputs of Paris was they said, well, do we know what the difference between the different levels of risk between, say, a 2-degree world, and what are the extra benefits if we manage to keep temperature rises to less than that, and so less than 1.5 degrees? So they gave the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change a project to go away with and say, actually, can you do some research into this and actually look what the relative benefits? So they diligently went away and they did some research. And this is what they came back with. So this is very difficult to see, I understand, on the screen. But basically, I think the thick grey line is showing the top of the thick grey line is showing 1 degree rise, which is basically what we're locked into so far. The line at the top is showing a 2-degree line, and then the line halfway through, unbelievably, is showing 1.5 degrees. And basically what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change found is that, to their surprise, the actual difference in terms of impact and outcome was massively more positive if we managed to keep temperature rises below 1.5 than if we went to 2 degrees. So if you look at, on the far side there, it's got warm water corals. Purple shows very high risk, red shows high risk, and yellow shows medium risk. So the difference between 1.5, and 2 is that they're all dead, basically. And then the same things, if you look at it, translates into other areas as well, such as like the Arctic region. The outcome at 2 degrees is much worse than it is at 1.5, and things like coastal flooding, that's the same too. It's not a linear change, so twice the rise from what we've got to now doesn't lead to twice the impacts, it leads to many times the impacts. So the basic recommendation was, yes, there's a very strong case to keeping temperatures to as low as we possibly can. So, this is the global carbon budget. So that shows the speed at which we were pumping carbon as a global community, a kind of cosmopolitan community for the years. And the dark green is the amount of the carbon budget we'd burnt. By the time, and on the far side of the graph here, you've got the 1.5 budget. So that's the total amount of carbon that we can burn if you want to stay within 1.5. And she also shows the 2. And as you can see, as time goes on, we're heading faster and faster. So we're basically accelerating towards a sort of brick wall from a certain perspective. So, let me just move on. So this is what we've got, as I said earlier. And then how does this translate? If we want to move into a if we do want to restrain global temperatures to 1.5, what does that look like? Well, it looks like that. That's what we need to do if we want to keep global temperatures within 1.5 degrees. Now, wherever you are in terms of science, that strikes me as being quite a scary graph. And that doesn't indicate a sort of incremental, yes, let's just do a bit of a tweak there. That looks like quite a sort of, we've got to throw everything at the kitchen sink at this. So, I didn't know that had sound associated with it. So one of the problems with climate change, and a lot of the government's response is quite technocratic. Now, I'm of the view that technology is really important and that technology will play a very important role in how we deal with climate change. It's critical. However, if you go back to this graph, we've been using technology, we've been talking about sustainability diligently for 30 years, and there's only limited evidence that we've actually managed to make any change. I mean, there's a bit of a stabilization in the last 10 years or so, but uncoupling that from the kind of global recession, and it's certainly not moving in the direction that we need it to. Now, if we just focus on technology, it made it, but the problem with the focus on technology is it tends to have something called the rebound effect. So a couple of examples. In my first job, we got some funding. We did a project where we went around to local community, and we got this funding to retrofit people's homes. So we knocked on the door, bang, 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 and we can give you some free insulation in your house. So we put this insulation in people's houses, and then we would add up the carbon emissions associated with that, and we report back to the fund and say, look, wait, you use your money, this is how much carbon we saved. Now that is a standard way of thinking around impact and projects to do with sustainability. But we wanted to take it a bit further because there's this concept called the rebound effect, which is looking at the spin-on or the knock-on effects of the system. So what we decided to do is we'd go around to those people and we asked them, say, okay, what are you likely to spend? You've saved £200 off your energy bills, or £300. What are you most likely to spend that money on? So we went and interviewed them, and we trotted down, and the most common response that we got was, we probably have a holiday with that money. So it's okay, so let's add up the carbon emissions associated with that. And we did, and then that actually completely annihilated all of the carbon savings associated with the loft installation. Now, so that doesn't mean that technology is bad, the loft installation is good, but there's a systemic issue that sometimes doesn't get captured in this thing. And it's the same things that, and the way that we measure our carbon emissions, and this gets talked about in the news a bit. Greta Thunberg messaged it, she called it our kind of quirky accounting method. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with the way that we measure our emissions in itself. It's honest and true, but if you focus only on the UK's emissions, so say you've got a factory in the UK, and you're making a gizmo that you want to buy, if you move that factory over to China, under the current way of accounting it, if we then buy this product from China then, we say it's not UK's responsibility, it's the Chinese responsibility. And so we need to be beginning to think in a more holistic way of the way that we're capturing these emissions and the way that we're thinking about this problem. Because it becomes like whack-a-mole. If you just focus it on a very sort of single lever approach, what you tend to do is you whack the one mole and it appears some elsewhere. So it'll be either we whack the insulation one, but then the flying goes up, or we decide that we're not going to produce a certain type of steel in the UK, but then we'll just buy it from China instead. So it's actually a systemic problem that we need to be thinking of, which in my view means that it transcends just a technical thing, and it actually becomes more, it plays into a values-based concept as well. And just to come back, climate change is only one. I think climate change is one of the more important areas of environmental sustainability, but environmental breakdown is much bigger than climate change, and the other ways that humans are having an impact on the climate are also being in some cases highly problematic, particularly around things like biodiversity loss, and they tend to interact with climate change in unhelpful ways. So the fact that we're travelling down the Amazon rainforests increases our vulnerability to increased temperature rises, but also inhibits our ability to respond to it as well. So again, it's this sort of, and my view is, there's no, unlike some things in life, there's no way to be squeaky clean. We're all going to have an impact on the environment. There's no purist way of not impacting the environment. But the attitudes that we bring to the table in that and the way that we approach it have a huge bearing on whether we decide to, and this is where concepts such as, and virtues such as temperance come in. It's like, how much is enough? What do we need in order to lead a good life? What does a good life look like? What's a good goal for society to aim for? How do we deliver good lives? Is it about simply about material wealth, or is it about other things as well? And I think that's where some of the links with Stoicism begin to play in. So, what would a Stoic do? Now, another curiosity one might say is that if you look through the Stoic literature, and this may be my limited reading of the Stoic literature, but there's not a huge amount about sustainability within particularly the ancient literature. And you might say, well, actually that means that the ancient Stoics didn't care. I mean, you may view that. I would challenge that idea. I think it's that it didn't matter to them so much because 2,000 plus years ago, there were far fewer of us on the planet, and our ability to influence the planet was negligible. I mean, we didn't really understand our role as well as we do now. And just the fact that the types of lives that we're living and the number of us there, our impact was much lower. And also, it was much, much harder for us to survive. There's lots of predators out there that were basically trying to gobble us up wherever we went. And also, just disease and illness. It was a hard life in order to survive. I think there's a parallel with a kind of a father-son or say mother-daughter sort of relationship here. In that, when Stoicism was first emerging, we were like the proverbial child, and nature was like the adult, and we were basically vulnerable to nature, and we were at nature's mercy. And if you look at the dynamic between a father and a child, or father and a son, or mother and a daughter, it has an implicit power dynamics which has ethics associated with it. So if the little girl decides to slap their mother, you might say that's a bit naughty, but you probably wouldn't necessarily go far as that's bad or troubling. It would just be something that the mother's role to look into to try and educate the child to help them behave better. Whereas if the mother was beating her daughter or if the father was beating their son, as an external observer, you might think that's more problematic. And I think that unbeknownst to humans, like in general, what's happened is that as we've got more powerful, as there's more of us, and as the lifestyle technology has allowed us to dominate nature in more and more ways, we've moved from a sort of child to parent dynamic to becoming more like the parent. And in that sense, because we now have a huge amount of the decisions that we ourselves and also our governments make have increasingly bigger impact upon the planet, that it's changed the dynamic that we have, and it's changed the ethics involved with it. So I think that it's gone from being not a moral issue to becoming a moral issue, in my view, for those of us who have the agency in order to engage with it. So, this is the sort of the background thinking that I've approached it with. And then I was thinking in terms of how to frame this talk. And a few months ago, there's an interesting newspaper article that I read by Oliver Burkeman. And he was talking about sort of a transformational kind of view of how one might engage with climate change and sustainability. And he pointed to this, he started off talking about this study by a guy called Walter Simot, I think his name's Simot Armstrong. And this study was called It's Not My Fault. And apparently this is a 2005 study where Simot Armstrong basically, he scanned all the available ethical frameworks and basically came to the conclusion that climate change isn't his fault. It's like, he wasn't denying climate change. He said, well, I believe what the climate scientists are saying. It was more that having looked at all the ethical theories, he couldn't see any reason why he should change his behaviour. So he gave an example of why he should forego his weekly drive in his SUV because of the carbon emissions associated with it. And his logic he was saying is that yes, say the Arctic ice sheet might be melting, but it's not possible for me to make the connection between this square metre or this area of Arctic ice sheet melting and my behaviour. It's too distant, it's too complicated, it doesn't necessarily relate, so therefore there's no ethical reason why I should consider this. Now, I mean, you probably could get some very well-equipped philosophical academics to come in to argue either for that or against that. From my reading of Stoicism, that doesn't really sit well with me as a viewpoint. I don't really agree with that. So I think that just because we can't make that firm link doesn't mean that it doesn't matter. And so Burkeman then moves on into a second part of the conversation where he says, actually, one response to this challenge that Seymour Armstrong said, is if we move away slightly from a sort of technical analysis of it. So rather than say, okay, well, you're responsible, because you did that activity, you're responsible for that amount of ice sheet melting, are there other ways of thinking about it? And so he points to a guy called Charles Eisenhower. And Charles Eisenhower suggests this sort of mind kind of bending, kind of alternative way of thinking about it. So rather than trying to build a rational case for why we should do it, and use like a sort of fear-mongering approach, so kind of finger-wagging, you're being wrong, or trying to say, actually, there's a business case for this necessarily, or trying to say, well, actually, let's measure it in this way, or let's measure it by how many square meters of ice sheet you're responsible for. It's actually talking about what Eisenhower talks about love. And I can understand how, for some people, the term bringing love into this might seem unbelievably cuddly and a bit kind of, but it then made me think around the Greek concepts of love. So I'll move on a little bit. So, well, actually, he pointed to this quote, actually, which is from Derek Jensen. So when somebody asked the environmentalist Derek Jensen why did he care so much, why had he devoted his life to nature, responding to nature. And he gave this response. And he said, it's because I'm in love. And he talked about the salmon and the trees and the birds. And he talked about the emotions that it imbued within him. And again, that struck me. And I think that in this room there'll be some people who are kind of theistic and there's some people who be atheistic. And I think regardless of where you sit on that spectrum, I think there's a case for thinking, well, actually, from a certain point of view, nature's not this external thing that sits outside of us. We actually are nature. I mean, and I think that the Stoic concept, living in accordance with nature, could probably be expanded to actually living within nature's boundaries as well, in my view. And so we are nature, and it's not something outside from us. So therefore, our relationship with nature matters. And just going back to this kind of love concept, so rather than being sort of like the modern interpretation of love, this graphic was taken from the South Bank Centre from a couple of years ago. They did a big exhibition on love, and they talked about the different types of Greek love. So they've got, you've got the erotic love, I think in the top left, you've got, and then you've got, I think it's pronounced philothea, which is self-love, in the bottom left. You've got agape, which is kind of universal or godly type love. It's kind of love for the world. And I think within there you could talk about a kind of like a veneration of nature. So it's kind of like nature's worthy of being loved or venerated. And then you've got things like philos or philia, which is friendship, which is the one in the middle. You've got ludos and playfulness and kind of flirtation just here. You've got pragma, which is kind of loyalty and standing in love and kind of being there for people even when it's tough. And then you've got storge, I think that's at the top, which is kind of familial love. And all of these are different ways of thinking about love. And I think that these ways can influence the way that we work with people around us, but also, particularly with agape, it's actually in the context of the way that we engage with the world and essentially cultivating this sort of sense of love for the world. So what essentially Eisenhower is talking is that rather than constantly focus on sort of technical solutions or a technical approach to it, the role is to actually essentially fall in love with nature or to expand our capacity with nature. And that's where I see the link with Stoicism, because I think if we do that, you can make the link that virtue, so if you take virtue as being excellence or moral excellence, then actually developing agape for nature, and developing, essentially, this is from Heracles' Circles, and Heracles is Stoic, and essentially, as in our early moral development, we tend to focus on the self and our self-improvement, and there's nothing wrong with that. The self is the wellspring of all other types of love, in that until you actually develop things like integrity and self-regard and a certain sense of personal fortitude, it's difficult for you to be of service to other people, be that your family and friends and community. But once we do it, part of our growth and part of developing virtue is expanding these concentric circles so that we expand our area of concern. And I guess what I'm saying is that if you go back to the earlier graphs where we were talking about how carbon emissions are rising like that, and we need them to go like that, then what I'm saying is that as what I can see is I feel that there's a case for us as Stoics to reflect on whether we should be trying to accelerate and expedite our own move through these circles, so that can we, in caring for ourselves and caring for our family and friends, can we also begin to try and integrate care for all humanity and the Earth and other species on the planet at the same time? And this plays into the kind of Stoic concept of cosmopolitanism. So I'm not, in Socrates' words, I'm not an Athenian or a Greek, but a citizen of the world. And in my view, I think with the kind of the extent of the problems that we face, and not just within climate change and environmental breakdown, but in terms of things like the kind of coronavirus or terrorism or technologies change or whatever dimension you're looking at, our ability to influence the planet is growing exponentially in many ways, and that we will need, in order to navigate the 21st century well, we'll need to be able to develop more of this kind of cosmopolitan mindset to do that effectively. So, what does that mean? Well, the best quote I found here is Epictetus. First, say to yourself, what would you do? Or, sorry, what would you be? And then do what you have to do. Now, I understand how this could seem very sort of pious and virtuous, not virtuous, pious and annoying. And there's this kind of this sort of like lecturing and this sort of the Greta Gelt sort of idea and saying that must not do this and stuff. I think each of us just have our own relationship with virtue and our own sense of what's excellent within our own situation. And that doesn't necessarily, to go back to that example there, that doesn't necessarily mean forgoing that weekly drive in SUV, although it might. It depends upon that person's relationship with virtue and how they see virtue. I'm struck by a saying I went to a Buddhist retreat a few years ago, where at the end of the retreat, they didn't have a set price for the amount of money that people had to pay, and you were basically asked or invited to give a donation, but they didn't actually tell you how much the donation should be. But the advice that they gave you said simply give the amount that you can give without regret. So if you, as you leave, if you basically gave nothing, and you might feel regret for having benefited from their hospitality for the last week and not giving anything in return, and you might feel a bit of shame. But if you're struggling and you don't have much money, and you gave £2,000, but you don't really have that, then you might feel regret for giving more when it's disadvantaged you or your family in another way. So you have a regret there. So what's the golden mean? What's the appropriate amount that you can give without regret? And I think that's a really good metaphor for our engagement with sustainability. What's the amount you can give without regret? For each of us, in our own means and situation, what does doing our bit or contributing our part look like? I think that's a good reflection. And then for people who are slightly more wanting slightly sort of more of a yeah, but how? This is from off Twitter, in fact. It's by climate scientist Peter Kalmus, when he was asked by people, what should we do? And he gave me 6 points, which I think are as good a start anyway. And again, I think that there's links here with Stoicism. It's about using your voice and joining together and walking the talk. So if you look at walking the talk, I see that as the link with integrity. And I think if you go back, and I think this was talked on this morning, but I don't see Stoicism as being an exclusively internal focused philosophy. I think if it becomes an a completely internally focused philosophy, in my view, we're misinterpreting it. I think it's also about the way that we engage with the world and what we speak up for and what we challenge and what we support and what we raise up and what we try and oppose. And I think that's, in my view, one of the ways to virtue. And I think that that line at the end, all individual action helps collective action, and all collective action comes from people, essentially captures it. And it just, I was talking to somebody about earlier, I'm sure all of you, if you cast your minds back to, and there might be some chemists in a room, chemistry lessons where we, you're talking about different phases, so you've got, and phase changes between different types of, say, liquids. So you might start off with ice, and then you move to water and gas. And if you start off with ice, you have to heat it up, and it takes a lot of time. So it's a lot of effort. Nothing really happens for ages. This is like individual action. Nothing's really happening. All of a sudden, you get to kind of 0 degrees, and then it begins to melt, and the phase change, and you get a sudden big release of entropy, I think it is, and you get a lot of change, and it suddenly becomes water. I think social change is a bit like that. Nothing will happen for a while, and then when you get enough individuals actually integrating into their behaviour and making the change itself, you get the phase change, and then happens again. So you heat the water up for a bit, eventually reaches boiling, and then it starts to steam, and you phase change again. And my hope is that through people like yourselves who are essentially practicing Stoicism, trying to integrate things like sustainability into your behaviours and your values and the way you engage at work, that we can help create those sorts of phase change. And just to finish, not everybody, it's not necessarily about doing more. Not everybody has to be a Greta Thunberg. Not everybody's well equipped to being a Greta Thunberg. There's not enough space for everybody to be, and it's not where each of our benefits and the way that we can contribute to society works. We all have our own ways, and it could be everything from, for the people who do go into investment banking, it's where there's a decision, and it's you might have, it's like we can invest in these 1 or 2 companies, and we'll make an extra. And it might be a relatively small amount of money. It might be, I don't know, we'll make an extra £20,000 by going down this route, but it involves like decimating a really important habitat or releasing lots of extra carbon emissions. And you're sat in that room, and you maybe not the most senior person in the room, but you think, oh, maybe I shouldn't say anything because it might actually it might make them think badly about me. But then you call on courage in order to say, well, actually, should we really be? Should we weight it towards going for the slightly more environmental option in this case, and actually calling on that courage to make that challenge? It can be things like that. It doesn't necessarily have to be sacrificing your career or spending everything. It's actually the smaller integrations that you do on your day-to-day basis. So, to finish, the world doesn't want to be saved, she wants to be loved, and we could do that through the Greek types of love, and that's how we save her. Thank you.